Hi, I'm Tom Eschen, the host of this Power in Politics podcast, the conversation about the issues that are impacting you the most with the people that are making those decisions, holding them accountable along the way, also speaking with the advocates that are pushing for change. Today we speak with New York Immigration Coalition President and CEO Murad Awawdeh. He talks to us about the new federal administration's policies and state policies that they've been pushing for, even at the New York State Capitol in the recent days. Thanks so much for listening. As always, you can listen wherever you get your Power in Politics podcasts, or you can watch on YouTube at CBS6 Albany. So Murad Awawdeh joins us now. He's the president and CEO of the New York Immigration Coalition. Thank you for coming on with us. We appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me.
Let's begin with, why you're here in Albany, in the state capitol, for obviously a couple days and advocating as you do. What is the reason and why here to start the session do you think it's important to have the voice of yourself and your organization heard?
Well, the New York Immigration Coalition holds its annual member congress every year at the start of session, where we bring together over 200 of our member organizations to come and convene here to strategize, to build together, to learn from each other, and then to advocate for our communities. We're here today and tomorrow to ensure that our state legislator, as well as everyone in Albany, all of our lawmakers, understand that we're here fighting for the Access to Representation Act to ensure that people have legal representation when they're going in front of deportation courts, that people have the Working Families Tax Credit, because we know that families are hurting right now and they deserve the credit that they need, and putting money back in the pockets of parents, making sure that the New York for All Act becomes a reality, because the state should not be using its resources to collude on separating families with the incoming administration. And then language access, making sure that we actually have strong policies on language access, because every time that there is a disaster, which is becoming more and more often, people are not getting information in the languages that they speak, which then often leads to their death. And we saw that happen in Buffalo. We saw that happen during the Buffalo blizzard, but also we saw that happen with Hurricane Ida, where people didn't get the evacuation notices in their language and then died in their homes because they got flooded out.
You alluded to it a few moments ago. Obviously, new administration coming in at the federal level. What do you think is different this year? We've heard, I guess I could say, we've talked about this legislation now for the past couple of years and just not getting over the finish line. What is different about this year, I guess, with all those things considered?
I think what's different about this year is the urgency of the moment that we're living in. We have a very hostile federal administration that's not coming in just to attack immigrant communities, but also attacking everything that New York stands for. Right? This isn't a moment for us to bend our values or to say New York stands for some people but not all. New York has been the most inclusive state in this nation and needs to continue to champion that, and has benefited from it. So we really want to make sure that all communities that call New York home are protected, but also that our state is actually addressing some of the real challenges ordinary New Yorkers are feeling across the entire state, from Buffalo down to the East End, Long Island, from the North Fork up to the North Country.
Well, New York, as they've had supermajorities in the Senate and the Assembly in the last couple of years, one of them not anymore, but still majority, and a Democratic governor. What's gotten in the way of this legislation moving forward?
I think with the Access to Representation Act, I think education. People need to understand that the immigration system that we have right now at the federal level is incredibly arcane and broken. When anyone shows up to immigration court, they're going up against a prosecutor and a judge whose sole job is to remove them from this country, regardless of whatever the infraction may be. And for the most part, there is no infraction, but they may have fallen out of status, or they may have had multiple parking tickets that turn into, from violations to misdemeanors. So these are the things that when people are going into these situations, for the most part, you have 10 times chance of winning your case if you have an immigration attorney. And if the Access to Representation Act became law, and that we invested $165 million in immigration legal services, the city's going to have over $4 to $8 billion in economic drivers being created in that moment as well. So it really is an important aspect for people to understand what the bill does, which is what we're doing, right? We're trying to educate folks. And the same with New York for All. I think there's been apprehension. It's a public safety measure. That's what it is. At the end of the day, it's saying that we support our communities. What we're doing is saying if you have an issue, or if you've been a victim of a crime or witnessed a crime, you should go to law enforcement and not be afraid that they're going to call ICE or immigration officials on you. And you should feel comfortable to do that. We're already seeing people not going to the police to report crimes because they're scared that the police are going to call immigration officials on them. It also says that people who get sick should go to the hospital and get the care that they deserve, because we just lived through a global pandemic and there's always a new virus coming up every other day. We want to make sure that New Yorkers feel safe, and that's what New York for All Act does.
With that in mind, I want to ask you about this, and something that I actually coincidentally asked the mayor of Albany about today. Think about the sanctuary status, and that means apparently different things to different people, municipalities at the end of the day. I asked that under the impetus of what you saw in Denver a few weeks ago with their mayor, Mike Johnston, who at one point said, we want to send out our local police to the edge of the county. You know, I'll get there to stop federal immigration people from coming to take people away, if you will, in terms of that mass deportation plan. So do you think, especially if it's a sanctuary status, municipalities should be taking it upon themselves to stop the federal government from coming in to carry out mass deportation?
You know, I appreciate the theater and politics sometimes, and most times
it's a good way, theater and politics. Yeah,
it's not helpful sometimes though as well. So I think the reality is that the federal government and federal agencies will do what they want to do. That is their power as a federal agency. What we are saying is that localities and the state should not be participating in that work, and what it ends up becoming is the collusion with separating families, destroying communities, and gutting our local economies. So sanctuary policy, literally and point blank, is just a public safety measure at the end of the day. It says that people should not feel afraid to live in their communities and actually support the ability to keep all of our communities safe. And study after study also shows, because I know that crime will come up in conversations like this, people are always like, well, what about the crime? Reports illustrate that for the longest periods of time, immigrants actually make communities safer. And there's several studies that illustrate that. So I think that this is part and parcel to sanctuary policy, which are public safety measures, right? It tells people, feel comfortable in going to local law enforcement if you need to, for whatever the reason is. Feel comfortable going to a hospital. Feel comfortable sending your kids to school without the fear of the school turning your kids over to immigration officials. That's like basics of wanting to live a fulfilling life.
I wanted to, before we get back to some of the state legislation, I think that's in this realm that's been proposed at this point, not necessarily some of the things that you've been pushing for. I did want to talk about the Laken Riley Act, which was, of course, passed in the House and now looks like it's going to be moving through the Senate here. This, of course, part of this new Republican administration, and when it comes to the presidency, the Senate, and also the House, mandating federal detention of immigrants without legal status accused of theft, burglary, and other crimes. How do you take that in terms of something that's going to be moved upon apparently at the federal level at this point?
So first and foremost, what happened to Laken Riley is incredibly horrendous, and it's incredibly gut-wrenching. And Laken's family is mourning, their community is mourning, and instead of honoring their life, what we're seeing is because of an act of an individual who the criminal justice system has actually already run the course with that person. They're going to be serving life in prison. Yeah. What is happening now is punishing an entire community, millions of people, for the actions of one person. And that's just unfair. And HR 29 actually strips people of their constitutional rights. That's it. That's what it does. It says that if you are a person who's an immigrant, and it's not just undocumented folks, it may be people on temporary statuses, and maybe people who are already checking in with ICE, right? For any infraction, will have to face indefinite detention, regardless of the outcome of the case. And this is not about people being convicted of a crime. This is about people who there's an allegation or have interfaced with law enforcement. That is what this bill does. And it also strips away people's rights because it enacts policies where state AGs can reject people based on certain immigration statuses, where they're just like, we're not recognizing this. It's taking away rights of people who call this country home.
How do you respond when you hear or see that people voted for this in a majority? Not as big of a majority as some would lead you to believe, especially when it comes to the presidency, but the Republicans are in the majority. They're the ones that passed this. and saying this is what the American people voted for. How do you respond to that?
The American people did not vote on a mandate of mass deportation and indefinite detention of families, children, and harming our communities and our economy, right? What people across this country voted for, the mandate, was actually a referendum on the affordability crisis that we're all feeling. And that is not something that I am saying. This is what came out of nearly every single national exit poll that happened on Election Day, where the number one issue, the top issue that voters had was affordability or the economy. So instead of actually addressing that, they're going to actually pass what seems like passing a law to continue to strip away rights from people. And that's not actually delivering, because what's going to end up happening with this mass deportation plan is, instead of addressing the affordability crisis, they're going to make it even worse, because the people who pick, pack, store, stock, and work in our businesses that are feeding us and nurturing us are going to be devastated. What we're going to see is the construction industry devastated, healthcare industry devastated. So how is this helping anyone? It's actually not. It's going to create more harm. And studies have already come out and shown that if mass deportation was a success, let's say it is, right? We're going to see anywhere between 4 and a 7.8% drop in our GDP. At the lower end of it, that drop in the GDP is actually worse than the Great Depression. And at the top end of it, it's double or triple the Great Depression rates. So what is it that we're actually doing? And that's the questions that people in New York need to be asking their legislators. I think that when we speak to folks who, a farmer was like, well, I voted for Trump, and then has immigrants as their workforce, like, well, they're not going to do mass deportation. No, they are. And it's going to impact you. And I think that then really illustrates to people that this is a moment where they need to raise their voice about what this means to them and their communities and the human impact of this. What happens when a parent gets deported? What happens to their children? And if it's a one-parent household, that child will end up becoming a ward of the state that they live in. Here in New York, they'll go into child services, and then the state takes on the financial burden of rearing the child and helping them get through life. And that's also another impact to the state and all New Yorkers.
You mentioned farmers. We did have the agricultural commissioner of New York on here, said that's been something on their radar now as they've watched this election unfold. And it's about half, at least, their workers that could be affected by
70%.
this. 70% of their workers. So that's one aspect of this. I did want to also bring about another aspect of the funding and think there are people that, and I've heard lawmakers say this, well, you spent billions of dollars trying to facilitate the transition of these individuals here into our society, and they think they'll be saving on that. How do you respond to that?
So,
because you mentioned the money that they'd be losing by losing these individuals. Someone that would present, well, we're already spending $2.4 billion, whatever it's going to be in the state budget, to help housing, help with them with their services, things of that nature.
Yeah, immigrants in the state of New York contribute over $68.1 billion in combined taxes to the state. $68.1 billion. So a small investment, and I know that $2.4 billion is a lot of money, but also this is also powering our future. We lost a huge population over the past 6 years because of the affordability crisis. Let's face the facts here. New York has not actually addressed the issues that ordinary New Yorkers are facing day in and day out, which is they can't afford milk and eggs.
Yeah.
And they continue to not be able to afford milk and eggs, but at the same time are having to hear from their legislators that, we can't fund this, we can't fund that, we can't help you, we can't fund these services that would actually help remediate the issues and the challenges that you're facing. And at the same time, we're seeing our communities continue to contribute to the local economies. The influx of people who came into New York over the past couple of years, for instance, in New York City, saved dozens of schools from having to shut down. It saved communities. I think that what we're missing here is that historically, every wave of immigration has contributed greatly to the economy and to New York. Point blank. And the reality is that without immigrants in New York, what is New York? Every single person, nearly every single person who's called New York home, them or their family has come from somewhere else.
You go back in time and you think about how you go back in history and how immigration has worked, in this country, and you'll hear some say, well, mine went through Ellis Island, they did it the right way. What is the equivalent of that today?
Ellis Island
is very different.
Ellis Island wasn't actually the right way. Ellis Island became the way, but it wasn't initially the way, right? So I think all you needed to do is show up at Ellis Island, carte blanche. That's it. You just showed up. They wrote your name down, and then you were let in. Then they changed it to the right way, being like you have to show up to Ellis Island with like $20 in your pocket. Then they changed up the policy. So like there's been different iterations of immigration, right? Yeah. And it will continue to be different iterations. What we need to actually do to address the challenges is we have an arcane immigration system that needs to be reformed and actually fixed so that we're having better systems in place to help the people who've been here, who've called this country and the state home for 30 plus years and have not had the ability to adjust their status, get the relief that they need, but also create the systems for a 21st century immigration system that a country like ours deserves.
How long has it been that way?
The last time anything's been done was 1986 or 87 under President Ronald Reagan.
What's, I guess, fallen short since then? We've had different administrations on both sides of the aisle.
We've had different administrations. Historically, it's been the Republican Party that has championed immigration. And if you go back to the debate between Ronald Reagan and George H. Bush,
H.W. Bush.
H.W. Bush.
Yeah.
You'll hear an incredible debate between them about why we need immigration, why immigration's so good for this country. And, on his way out, President Reagan said the biggest travesty to this country would be shutting down the American dream by closing our doors to new Americans. The party has shifted since then, but at the same time, we've not seen the political courage to address the problems that we're seeing at the federal level.
And I think you alluded to it earlier, theatrics have really taken over the past few years, you could say, with these bills that have been scuttled, that have been not presented, and I've heard that from both sides of the aisle.
Yeah,
right, at the end of the
absolutely.
day. Yeah.
And what you end up seeing is historically in this country, it's been the Republican Party that's actually passed any meaningful and pro-immigrant policies. That has been the case. And then what you end up seeing on the Democratic side is they'll take the horrible rhetoric that we see from the far right fringe, and then they turn it into policy. You saw that happen with Bill Clinton. You saw that happen with President Obama. You saw that happen with President Biden, who actually enacted even more severe policies on immigration and is going to make Donald Trump's job easier than it was in 2017 to actually work on harming our communities.
And you're alluding to those executive orders from
executive
late in the spring,
orders,
early summer, June, July.
Yes, as well as
which we have seen border crossings, the statistics at least, go way down since then, as low as they've been, right?
Well, he used a Trump policy to do that. So, but he did it in the right way as opposed to when Trump did it. Again, Trump delivers, unfortunately, on his promises of harming our communities. And that's what we're trying to ensure that our state is not participating in.
What about detention centers? I know there's been legislation, some Democrats are on it, that would make them go away, not allow those to happen, allow any individuals to be in a detention center and make sure that those things are rooted out. I'd imagine that that's something you support.
I think it's not ending detention centers, because the ones that are the only detention center in the state of New York is in Batavia, New York. And then Varick Street is also considered a detention center in New York City. But there is a dignity not detentions bill, which says that here in the state of New York, that our local jails and prisons will not contract to house individuals, because that's not what those facilities were built for. And this goes back to ensuring that there's a clear line between the divide of government, right? That the federal government is doing what the federal government does. It will not impact Batavia, nor will it impact Varick Street. But there were moments where even here in Albany County Jail, you saw under the Trump administration that people from the southern border were moved to New York and moved to the jail here. And that was not very helpful, because it just then dispersed people in ways not supportive of keeping them near their lawyer, keeping them in the states that they were going to or where their family connections were.
And you said Albany County, which piqued another thought that I had about the Tren de Aragua narrative. You could say the gang infiltration, however it's been painted. And there were concerns. The Albany County Sheriff said, well, I mean, I don't have to see them to know that they could be here. And I had other individuals that are advocates for immigration say, well, at the same time, yes, that could be true, but we believe that they're preying upon people that have come to do this the right way. Where do you fall on that line of this gang that's been, down in New York City? You heard I think it was one of the police officials talking about it. Where on that presence of them and where some of these conversations have gone?
I think on the comments around gangs, specifically in New York City even, we have a mayor who, instead of really trying to fix the city, continues to double and triple down on scapegoating communities, right? He held a press conference, and I'm assuming this is what you're alluding to, where his former police commissioner had this grand press conference talking about the rise in migrant crime and the gang situation. When asked specifically for weeks on end, please provide us with the data that you were referring to, they had no data to share. I think, as I mentioned earlier, right, you have immigrant communities who have been part and parcel to the city of New York, the state of New York, that have continued to allow our communities to thrive. I think that we have a criminal justice system, and we need to let that system work. We need to make sure that if there are allegations of crime and that people are doing whatever it is that they are doing, that the necessary branch of government is actually taking care of it. Be it the sheriff, be it the district attorney, be it whoever, and that they're doing thorough investigations, and everyone is entitled to due process. And a lot of the allegations that have been made about people being part of a gang, it's like, well, how do you know that they're part of a gang? They're like, oh, well, they have this a tattoo. And what's the tattoo?
Happened in Rensselaer. Yeah.
It's an anchor. And then it's like, okay, the Navy also has anchor tattoos. So if you think a person has an anchor tattoo and they were part of the Navy, are they part of a gang? Like, well, no. It's like, well, then how do you differentiate then? Or then does it just become a tactic of racial profiling?
Yeah, it's interesting because we had that happen just over the river in Rensselaer up here in the Capital Region, where I talked to the police out there after they had made their arrest of these individuals that apparently were involved in something that happened in Connecticut, which was horrible. But they said, in the release, they said, we believe they are a part of or have ties to the gang, and they cited those exact things. A tattoo, and then something an individual said is, I don't want them to find out or something. I guess, is that something that you've heard of this happening at the law enforcement side?
I think law enforcement needs to do its job, and they need to investigate any claim. And I think just perpetuating false narratives about immigrants are not helpful to the people who are impacted by the crime that they're trying to investigate, nor is it impactful or helpful to the communities that they're supposed to serve and protect as well.
So you've been doing this for how long now?
I've been with the organization for a little bit over 11 years. I've been in this position for going into my 5th year.
Why? What's your why when you do this?
My family emigrated to the United States for the same reason everyone continues to come to this country, for opportunity, for a better life for their kids. I think for me, I come from a mixed status family. My family has had to have really difficult conversations. We've gone through every single iteration of the immigration processes, from applying for status to going through court. And the system has just been so unjust in every regard. So for me, I'm really invested in trying to make sure that we make gradual change that actually helps people in their day-to-day life, that the conditional material changes, that it's not just like a theoretical thing, you're actually feeling it. So that's what's important to me, is that we're actually delivering for our communities.
At the end of the day, how do you know you did your job? Is there a moment? Is there a person? Is it something that you feel?
Yeah, I think it's something that you feel, and then you also see it, right? We've had amazing success stories across the state of New York. We've been doing legal clinics and supporting our membership across the state, and doing rapid response legal services for the past couple of years, and just seeing people start really moving through the system, guided through with lawyers from our office and from our members' offices, and seeing people go from just applying for asylum to then applying for their work EADs, being able to start working the formal economy, getting into an apartment, and then building their lives with their families is part and parcel on the road to the American dream.
Yeah, and I'm sure when you come up and rally at the Capitol or speak and you see the others that have been impacted speak, that probably has to be like, wow, this is, look at where they are now. You know, what an example.
You know,
right?
we had 3 or 4 impacted people speak today, someone whose family was unjustly caught up in the immigration system based on faulty information. And then we had another person speak about their family's experience with not getting language access and then being able to do it, but only because their children, who were like 10 years old, were able to translate for them in really important moments at doctor's offices, at immigration interviews. You know, folks who are struggling right now with the affordability crisis and really fighting for not just themselves and their families, but for their community, and saying, you know, we need legal services, we need language access, we need New York for all, but we also need the working families tax credit, is really powerful.
Yeah. Murad, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
No, thank you.
Thanks for listening. Hit the subscribe button right now so you can stay up to date on these news-making conversations about the issues impacting New Yorkers the most: power and politics.